Welcome to the joint session of the afternoon and to the traditional Agile by Example discussion panel. And I have to say, it's a pleasure to do it again in person after 2 years of virtual conference. And it's a special pleasure because the panel is really outstanding this time. So we have Jutta Eckstein, consultant and coach. She will be the keynote speaker tomorrow morning. We have Steve Deming, author and thinker about management, and he was delivering the keynote speech this morning. We have Craig Larman, who is one of the 2 co-creators of LESS, and I don't think I have to tell you more. Everyone knows LESS, even though not everyone uses it yet. And Craig will be delivering the afternoon keynote just after we finish. And finally, Professor Dave Snowden, whom most of you know from Kinevin, but he has more contributions than that. With that, I will start the discussion by pointing out that we had obviously massive amounts of change and instability within the last 3 years or so. And it seems to be increasing. We now have not only the pandemic, we have a war, we have energy crisis brewing, all types of instability. And it would seem that in an environment like this, Agile is an obvious choice, and more companies should, an organization should strive to be more and more Agile. And I wonder whether from your vantage points you see that actually happening, and if not, then what is your take on that? Why not?
Well, I cannot get started if nobody starts. So, especially the pandemic, I thought this is on the one hand great, because for so long we have been talking about VUCA and what it does, and that we need to be agile also as companies. And now there's this example where companies have created in, I don't know, lengthy meetings by the end of 2019, their financial budgets, just for one example, for 2020. And at latest, by March, they could just put it all in the trash. And so this is one of the things we kept talking about, that you need to be more flexible. If you want to be agile as a company, you need to be also more flexible in terms of budgeting. And here's your example, and you see that it's not working. And actually, I see some companies really understanding it, which doesn't mean everyone does. But that bold or strong example of what VUCA really means, I guess everyone has seen that.
Is this what it is working? One of the things you might want to look at is I was a principal author on the European Union Field Guide on how to managing complexity in a crisis. So there's a whole body of stuff in that you can draw down from free and use. Personally, I don't think Agile is a broad enough church to handle the crisis. Yeah, there's so much else you actually have to do. We talk about resilience in terms of building informal networks, human sensor networks. There's a whole body of stuff on knowledge mapping you need to bring in. There's distributed decision-making rather than delegated decision-making. And I think there is a severe danger that Agile tries to sell itself as a silver bullet rather than recognize its limitations. And you can't just own everything which is to do with agility. Now, having said that, I mean, I've said several times, COVID was a chance for us to get it right because it's going to get worse. We know that there are bacteria thawing out in Siberia at the moment for which we've got no natural resistance whatsoever. And bacterial plagues have a bigger impact on humans than viral plagues. So we really need to be building organizations now which can cope with events which cannot be anticipated. Right? And that's the big switch in strategic thinking which is going on at the moment. And Agile can make a contribution to that, but Agile isn't the whole solution to it.
But is that change actually taking place? That change of thinking that you were describing?
Oh yeah, I mean, you can see it. You can see it starting to happen. For those of us who've been ploughing the complexity field against the opposition of all the systems thinkers for the last 20 years, all of a sudden it's got a lot easier. Because what COVID did is it made people realize that you had to do things differently. So the concept of human sensor networks, for example, we're now starting to build even into clinical trials, which would never have taken anything that unstructured before, but people are realizing the need for change. But there's another key thing, though, because if you look what happened in the health service, they got rid of all regulations during COVID. And some of us were saying, bring them back, but bring them back differently. Don't just say we don't need them anymore. Because if you say that, what will happen? The minute the crisis is over, all the old regulations will come back, and that's exactly what happened, right? So there are things you can do in a crisis that you can't do outside of the crisis, and you need to use them as opportunities to what we call micro-nudge change. Yeah, and to be quite honest, the big word I would ban in Agile, well, I banned several things. I banned the whole mindset concept, because it's just really, really bad science. But I banned the concept of transformation. You know, we need renaissance, not enlightenment. We need to recognize what was valuable in the past and will be valuable in the future. And we need an evolutionary approach, not a transformationary approach, because that has some chance of surviving.
Of course, I could easily be wrong. I've been working in software development since the 1970s, and I've seen many management fads. And I don't think I've seen a single fad where anything meaningful was actually adopted or changed. And as some of you know, I've been involved in the Agile fad almost exclusively for 25 years. And in those 25 years, as you can imagine, I've been involved in a lot of experiences. One of the things that maybe is a little bit different about what Bus and I do is that we both work as hands-on developers in addition to organizational design consultants. And so I move between, say, the C-suite and the C developers. And so from that perspective, it seems to me in my 25 years focusing in the Agile space, hands-on, I've seen almost no company in the world ever adopt anything close to Scrum or XP or Agile. Maybe there's a few thousand companies in the world where anything even close has been adopted. What I've seen again and again over about 40 years is what I call change theater. And for almost every organization, what's really going on is management careerism. And the real goal of most organizations is to create a platform and a context for managers to go through careers, climb the corporate ladder, extract money through bonuses and so forth. And they play games where they put new labels on existing things. They're perfectly fine with changing practices, but anything that actually touches the status quo of the existing organizational design in terms of structures, policies, career paths, it's all just mutated into some minor variation of the status quo to fit in. So as far as I can tell, not only during COVID was there almost no adoption of agility. In the last 25 years around the world, I've seen almost no agility. The market for companies that actually deeply want to change, it seems to me, is quite small. There's too much money. The market for fake change and fake agile is just enormous, and you can make an entire career out of it. And in fact, if what you do here's how to become a millionaire. Create an organizational system where you tell the senior management that they'll get all the things that they might want using the current buzzwords. And last, it won't actually challenge their current status quo. You'll sell a lot and you'll be very popular.
Are you talking about SAFe?
No, I'm not. I know, and I'm really not. I know almost nothing about it. I mean, even just, I go to, for 25 years, I go to all these places that say they've adopted Scrum. No.
They didn't.
It's just lipstick on a pig.
Just go to any McKinsey's website and look at its history, and you've got a whole list. Yeah? It's the same platitudes regurgitated time and time again. The same leadership qualities regurgitated time and time again.
Just sounded like SAFe, like
blue ocean strategy.
Tell them what they're asking for.
We've just, oh God, we've been through them all.
So that's kind of pessimistic, what you say, Steve.
To build on what Craig said, there's a huge amount of fake stuff going on in the world, and quite discouraging, the lack of take-up. And this morning, we had confirmation that large proportion of the people in the room are working in organizations which are top-down hierarchies, bureaucratic, and not open to change. It was a little bit more encouraging that within their own groups at the lower level of the organization, they were in fact operating, well, a larger proportion were operating in a much more open and agile and customer-oriented fashion in the what I see as a new way of running organizations. But the problem is really at the top of the organization, as that kind of informal survey showed. And then Agile, by solving problems at the lower level, is providing the groundwork for change. But unless we can get change at the top of the organization, we are not going to make very much progress. And that's what my talk was about. How do you get that? And what we've also learned is that managers in these big organizations, for the reasons Craig mentioned, don't want to change, don't know how to change, and are being paid not to change. And simply telling them how they should change, telling them how to change doesn't really work. And so what we've seen does work is to take executives who are, in fact, in a genuine change mode, who have gotten out of bureaucracy and who are operating, creating value for customers and having teams operate throughout the whole organization in a network and not in a top-down bureaucracy, and have processes that support that. By sharing those stories, what we see is that other executives start to realize that this is real, that this is possible, that in fact it's liberating for them as executives, because being a control-minded executive is a very stressful existence. And when executives actually make the change, they find that it's personally liberating. And so sharing those experiences, getting those executives who have already made the change, like Satya Nadella in Microsoft, like Bill Anderson in Roche Pharmaceuticals, those executives can inspire other executives that this, in fact, is possible, it's desirable, and in fact, is necessary.
Yeah, one of the problems, though, is they end up speaking to a ghost author who writes a best-selling book and creates a consultancy method out of it, and the fad cycle starts again. But I buy it in the main. I think there's something, if we go back to something Nanaka said, where Steve and I both first met in knowledge management, he basically said change is middle, bottom up. You need to move into the middle, go down, and then go up. And people need to realize, and I've been at C-level in IBM, and I've worked with C-level all my life, you get 5 or 6 minutes to make decisions most of the time. You really don't have much time for reflection. Very rare executives find a way to do it. The real change comes where you change middle management. The senior management will just do whatever they need to do to keep shareholders happy and to survive in their jobs. It's middle management that matter. We're having more impact in Singapore now, for example, because 20 years ago we started to train the junior civil servants in complexity. Now they're moving into senior roles and they start to understand it. But you've got a 10 to 20 year change cycle if you're really going to change culture. You can't change it overnight. And that middle management layer is the most important one, I think.
And picking up on Dave's comment about the education, I observe that in the small number of places in the world over the last 40 years where any meaningful organizational change has happened, it will be undone in 7 years or less, guaranteed. Because what happens is that the new managers come in and they say, what's this? I don't understand it. It's not like the familiar approach. And consequently, any deep, meaningful change we make at any level will be undone when that cadre of people leave and are replaced by others.
That's
I
what
really
you were
wonder
talking.
whether this pessimism is justified, and to say that you can only have meaningful change at the middle of the organization is really overlooking the very obvious experience of organizations where it is being led both at the top and in the middle and the bottom of the organization. Getting the whole organization in sync is the key, and that we shouldn't write off the top as being horrible people. We may not have access to them, but if we look around, and we can find that there are organizations that are doing this, and we should learn from them, not simply write them off and say they're just working with their shareholders and not interested in the issues we're in. I don't think that's true. I've seen examples where that's true.
Nobody's writing them off, Steve, all right? And nobody's saying they're evil people. We're saying they're people under considerable stress. I worked with Lou Gersten on the Senior Leadership Development Program. He was a brilliant guy. He achieved major change in IBM. He left, and coming back to Craig's point, within 2 years, Sam and Ginny had made it a bureaucracy again. And the issue is, you get the examples, but if you want long-term continuous change, it's not going to be led top-down. The top will be part of the change, but it's the middle managers who make the decisions and actually have the real budgets, and that's where you have to focus.
So from my experience, change can happen at any level, and it's more the question if there's a momentum and if there are enough allies to make it happen, so it can also start at the bottom. But I also do agree that if then there's which is also a change, if then there's another momentum because it's like a new CEO coming with other allies, which might lead a change which is just the opposite, then everything is just gone. And as we heard, I can't agree more. Typically, a culture change takes about 10 years. And so if you are not over those 10 years, then you're changing back like this. And just like the change that happened towards maybe being more flexible, responsive, and all that, you can also have the change that just goes the other way around.
Okay, so your talk in the morning was titled about capitalism. It was about capitalism. So I understood it as hinting that maybe to achieve a deeper change, we need to actually change the way society and economy are organized. Because those negative tendencies that you underlined in your talk, like focusing on profit, etc., there might stem from the way the economy is actually organized. In other words, if you don't focus on shareholder profit, it doesn't work very well. So do we need to actually change everything, change the way society is organized? Because there are those ideas like the Great Reset, Klaus Schwab's stakeholder capitalism comes to mind. Maybe others. What is your take on that?
Stakeholder capitalism is futile. By telling the firm to go in 4 different directions at the same time, you get the obvious result that you have total confusion. And so I didn't mention it this morning in the talk because I think it's like the Holy Grail. It leads nowhere. And it's simply unacceptable. What we're talking about, though, is in this customer capitalism, or whatever you want to call it might have different names, but it is radically different from how big organizations were run in the 20th century, radically different from what Gerstner was doing in IBM. It is a fundamentally different way of running an organization from the top to the bottom of the organization. So the more we can understand how it operates, the more we can understand how the principles and processes are radically different from what happened in the 20th century, then we can actually get more organization moving in this way. But stakeholder capitalism is not the answer.
I think most of us would agree on that one. I think there's a couple of other things. I'll declare an interest here. Back in the 1970s, I started my career as a Catholic Marxist working on liberation theology. And if I'm honest about it, I haven't changed my opinion since, all right? It's just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. But and I can tell you about experiences in East Berlin on that as well, if anybody wants to do it over a drink later on, all right? I have the privilege of having been arrested by the Stasi, which is I'm still quite proud of, all right? But I think we're doing a lot of work at the moment on new forms of citizen engagement, and I think you've got a complex ecosystem here. If you have one person, one vote, and 3-4-year election cycles, nothing is going to change in the regulatory environments related to neoliberal capitalism or to the climate change, and that's an issue, right? As long as companies are working in the stakeholder environment they are, it's going to be very difficult for them to change. I think the driver on companies, interestingly, and you're seeing this with some, I've always liked Apple in many ways. Steve Jobs did throw a pile of books at me once, I can't cry about that. But what you're seeing is companies, to retain talent, are having to change their ethics. And I think that's one of the agents of change, is retention of good staff, and actually people are walking with their feet. They want to work with people whose ethics they respect. That's far more likely to change things, I think, because it will start to build a new generation in terms of the way it works. That's something we can all play a part in. It's lots of little things starting to build. But we also, and I've just come back from Australia, we've been doing a lot of work with indigenous communities in Australia on what's called gifting cultures rather than exchange cultures. Because as long as you have a means of exchange, ownership of the means of exchange becomes where power is. Whereas in gifting cultures, you gift something, and in return for that, you are part of something, and it's not an exchange mechanism. So there are a series of movements, we're part of them at the moment, looking at new forms of citizen engagement, new economic models. It's why most of us dislike blockchain intensely, because it's just another elite creating another means of exchange. Yeah, and non-fungibles are the same thing, rather than genuinely rethinking the way we create society. What happened during COVID is actually, I mean, our village did it. Yet small villages and small communities started to create localized examples of gift. And I think we need to start to look at governance structures which will support that, where the boundaries between the firm and community also become much more dissolved, yeah, in terms of the way it works.
Well, I would agree definitely that finding and keeping talent is something that creates pressure on companies to act in a specific way, because otherwise they will not be able to do that. And I want to add to that I also see the same thing with creating and serving markets, because customers are in the same way having, providing that pressure on companies that they don't want to, well, there are still people out there, but more and more people say, I want to have a product where I know it's not built on child labor, or it is built by polluting the earth, or whatever it is. So there are more and more people who say, well, I don't want to work for a company like that, or don't want to buy a product from a company like that. So this is the one thing. The other thing that I also see in terms of changes, and Dave, you are bringing this up about like climate change and so on. So there's also, I found super good news that this week, it was the first time that in Europe an area was declared as a person with its own rights. So this is in Spain, and so if you will, of course it's represented by people then, but the area can actually go and sue against any kind of pollution and ensure that people will be punished for that if they do that. And there are more areas out there already in the world, and we will see more of these changes, but it also means for companies, they cannot so much more live on the cost of like the environment or whatever it is that supports actually that shareholder capitalism.
And to give an illustration of this, we've been working, I won't say who because I'm not allowed to, we've been working with one of the big oil companies because they have a massive problem retaining staff. Nobody wants to go to the pub and say, I work for an oil company. Now what we've been looking at, which I think will happen, is, if you don't know it, I mean, and this is an issue about decision theory, people keep trying to solve the problem of climate warming rather than doing things in the short term which give us more options to find solutions. Key thing in a crisis is to make decisions which create options open rather than try and solve the problem. So there's lots of things we could do. So one of the things where we know the science, for example, we know the science of refreezing the poles. Refreeze the poles, you get another 15 or 20 years before you get catastrophic effects. It's now an engineering problem. So what we're talking about is, why don't you let 20% of your engineers' time be put into that problem, because then they'll want to work for you on the oil rigs. And we're getting close on that. And I think it's that sort of creativity we need about starting to link doing good with actually retaining staff, doing business, attracting customers. Yeah.
So to go back to things more related directly to Agile, there are some attempts to kind of rejuvenate Agile. It's probably also the topic of your talk tomorrow. But what is your take on stuff like Agile 2 or Amplio by Al Shalloway and other initiatives like
Shallow
this?
by name, shallow by nature, you mean? I think, and I say this, the last thing we want is another bloody Agile movement.
Okay.
Another bloody framework. I said this yesterday in Lisbon because somebody stood up with Fast Agile. Yet another magic pill, all right? There is a huge amount in existing Agile methods and tools that we can repurpose and reuse in different combinations, and we need to get that right, and we need to stop the framework wars and stop the certification wars, and basically stop people saying, I have now got a magic pill or a magic solution. Yeah? And if you look at the Agile 2 thing, I mean, the manifesto is just hysterically funny. If you know anything about leadership theory or the raw science of it, it's just a group of people who haven't done their research throwing together a document in the hope that they can sell certification. Yeah, and Amplio is even worse, all right? Yeah, sorry, if you block me, I tend to follow you and read your material more closely. So I'm involved in that one at the moment, all right? Yeah, we've got to stop it. We've got to make the things that we already know work properly. This is the point Craig made. Nobody's implemented Agile yet, anyway. So maybe we should start with doing that.
It seems to me you don't solve change with better definitions.
Yeah. That's a great summary.
So I know that you wanted to change the topic, but
Okay.
I think we have more important problems to solve than rejuvenating whatever a manifesto that's out there for a long time, and it seems to be, I don't know, I don't think it's really aging. And still you can use it as a historical document or can use it in your work as you like, as it helps you. But again, I think we have more important problems to solve, and I think stuff like, sorry to bring it back, like saving our planet is something we all have a responsibility for, also in the Agile community. Like
So you think that the manifesto is less relevant now?
I don't know. For me, it is. So I'm more somebody who is agnostic. So I look at what is the problem, and so working with the experience of the people, what kind of thing can we do in order to find a solution that helps us to overcome that problem? And I don't care too much what it's called.
Okay, so nevertheless, we are on an Agile conference. Okay, so one other thing that was also an outcome of your talk, and we discussed that briefly after your talk, is that all of our discussion on management and structures and processes and how to change that and improve that, all of that is kind of West-centric, is centered on the collective West, if I may call it that way. And at the same time, we have the emerging power of China, where we have a number of very successful companies very quickly developing. And how much do we know? How much do you know how they are organized, how they work? Maybe there is a lesson there.
I've lived and worked in China, as has Bus, my friend and co-creator of Lassie, speaks fluent Mandarin, married to a Chinese woman. And so I've lived within the teams, etc. there. And there's very little difference. It seems to me that industry culture is stronger than national culture. So for example, if I go to a bank in China or a bank in Geneva, I don't see a lot of difference. And so to me, the hierarchy is, what industry am I in?
We also need to be careful about this West-East thing, all right? Because what you're really talking about is Northern Europe and North America, which was a dominant post-Enlightenment culture. There are different cultures in Southern Europe and elsewhere. So I think that's one thing. I think also, I mean, China's really interested at the moment. We're all taking, there's sweepstakes on whether the Communist Party will get rid of the leader in the next 3 months, and that's looking quite likely. The difference is, if you want to take a country which is going to do something about global warming, it's not the West, it's probably China. But it's only because they're a dictatorship and they're starting to build their ownership of natural resources. They will actually get rid of carbon emissions faster than anybody else because they're able to plan over a 20-year cycle. I mean, Singapore are planning to have most of their population in air conditioning for up to 3 hours a day. because they know within the next 10 to 15 years, sizable portions of India, Indonesia in the area will be uninhabitable. You know, it goes above 53 degrees, you die. So I think there's a sort of the governance structures actually provide a culture in which the industry operates. But I completely agree with Craig. Every Chinese company I've worked with has just felt like a Western company in terms of the way it's working, but possibly with a little less freedom, or the freedom's a little more difficult to see it coming through. Yeah? But otherwise, not a major difference.
Okay. Anyone else wants to comment on that point?
There was this article in the Financial Times about the new kind of Asian leader, which I'm not personally familiar with, but it was suggested that there are leaders who are very dictatorial, very tyrannical, demanding absolute loyalty. At the same time, they have very high personal moral standards, and they have a benevolence to their staff, which is admirable. And now we don't find any such leaders in the West, in Europe or the US. Those tyrants typically do not have high personal moral standards or the benevolence that they're talking about in the article. But it does cite particular executives who exhibit that, and some of the leadership in Singapore, you would suspect, is something like that. That would be a different kind of leadership if it does exist. But I say I don't have no personal knowledge of those executives.
As far as I can tell, there is no relationship between any journalist article or consulting report and what actually is happening.
It is actually, I mean, I agree with that. It is actually quite hysterical. You see these people who go and interview the Agile manager about the state of Agile in companies and believe what they're told. Yeah? And I remember in knowledge management days, we went and did field ethnography in all the big consultancy firms. There was zero correlation between what people did in the companies and what the knowledge management people said they did, right? Because it was that career. So that sort of ethnographic approach, I think, works. There is a fascinating thing about Chinese society, though. If you look at it historically, it's an interaction of Confucian rule-based and Taoist heuristic-based. And that interaction between rules and heuristics is a really interesting way of actually managing companies. So there are things I think we can learn, but they're not the sort of traditional things in terms of the way they work.
Okay, so McKinsey won't bring them to us, let's put it that way.
So what I see in...
Nobody gets fired for implementing a McKinsey's report. Yeah. That's how they make all their money.
So what I see in companies is that there are always, for example, for processes, but you can look at anything, there are three different ones. One is how it's defined. The second one is how people think it's done here. And the third one is that's actually creating something or is not creating something, which is typically all three of them are differ completely from each other. So it's not what people think is happening or is helping them, is really doing something for them.
And so there was this kind of like a small problem in the industry, in the Agile industry, if you can call it that way. But so we have conferences like this, and we have many presentations, not that many on this edition of AgileByExample, but on previous editions where representatives of different companies tell different stories about how Agile they did get and how successful they are in implementing Agile. The problem is, as a consultant, I sit in the audience, I hear that, but I know it's not true because I have been there. However, I cannot tell that because I'm A, bound by consultants' ethics, and B, I'm bound by an NDA, so I cannot say that. And the end effect of that is that people, and I've found out recently, that people are coming to me and asking me, maybe you know where I could apply for a job where it's actually true. Because I've been to like 3 companies, and it turned out not to be true in all of them. And usually I point them to some of the smaller companies that I know. But yeah, so maybe that's this change that you talked about at the beginning taking place, that people are actually kind of migrating to places that
I love Craig's concept of change, the change theatre. I think that's a lovely phrase, all right? And I think you have to realize if you're going to a large company, that's what you're doing. I mean, I left IBM, I created my own company. we don't want it to grow for more than about 30 people because then the culture will change. And it self-manages at the level below me, and we've only got 2 levels. Now, you can't do that in a big organization. You know, big organizations are in a different environment, and you sometimes have to say to people, look, guys, all right, you know, work is work, and sometimes it's not good, and you have to go and make the best of it. And sometimes you have to serve your apprenticeship. I was trying to explain that to my son, who's an accountant. I've got a daughter who's an anthropologist and a son who's an accountant. And I said, look, I spent 5 years, you know, adding up figures with primitive calculating bloody machines before I got the right to actually go and do something more interesting. It doesn't just happen overnight. And sometimes you've got to do, you know, serve your apprenticeship, get to understand how things really work, spend that time, do those things, have that conversations, move around between things, and don't assume it's all going to be fun, because it won't be. Yeah? And if you start off that way, it's going to go badly wrong.
Yeah, that's an area where, as Agile community, we have lots of improvement to do, because we have Agile coaches with 1 year or 2 years of experience, and that's probably not very helpful, right? Okay, we are nearing the end of our panel. Is there anything you would like in particular to leave our audience with? I know it's a hard question.
Okay, I'll go first because I've got to run, right? So, sorry, I've got another keynote to give in 45 minutes, so I've got that on my mind.
Good luck.
Yeah, it's a 15-minute walk, and I haven't thought what I'm going to say yet, but don't worry, I'll work it out on the walk, right? I think there's a key principle which is coming from complexity at the moment, which says stop talking about goals and stop talking about objectives and stop talking about ideal future states. Focus on describing where we are and what we can do next, and changing the energy gradients of the present so that the energy cost of virtue is less than the energy cost of sin. And if you want a simple metaphor for that, we call it the Frozen 2 strategy. Has everybody watched Frozen 2? Okay, well, if you haven't, all right, Professor Snowden told you to watch Frozen 2 because it's a great complexity movie, all right? And in the middle of the movie, the real heroine of the Frozen series, who's the younger sister without the magic, if you haven't worked that out, you don't know narrative, sings this lovely song, which has been made famous by a Ukrainian refugee, which is faced with despair, all I can do is do the next right thing. And understanding what the next right things are and doing them and then looking again is where we need to mill. That's why I don't like words like transformation, I don't like idealistic goals. Find out how to describe what you're currently doing and see where you can go next. What would be the advice?
My professional mission is to reduce suffering in product development. And one could take away from this discussion a kind of pessimism or deflation. But for me, whatever scope of influence that I could have, even if it's just to another person to help them be able to create cleaner code, I've nudged the world into a little bit less suffering than before, and that's good enough for me.
I do agree with Dave that we need to be thinking about a renaissance, not an enlightenment. That this is about not just thinking differently, but about a different kind of heart, a different kind of feeling, a different kind of sense that this is something that has to be deeply different from what we've had before. And a renaissance captures that spirit, that heart of what this is about. I do think, as I tried to say this morning, that we can find better ways to take stock of where we are, because taking stock of where we are enables us then to say, well, what would be the logical next step? And I do think, given the fact that most of you are working in organizations which are not change-oriented, that you have this harsh decision. Are you going to stay in those organizations and in the hope that they will eventually have leadership that can have this kind of heart, this kind of spirit, this kind of renaissance, and take the organization into that future? Or do you decide to move to a different organization which already has some of that leadership more in place or more likely to be in place? Those are the harsh decisions, difficult decisions, but they will determine, in a sense, what the rest of your life is like. If you stick around a hierarchical bureaucracy for several decades. It's really going to be a rather dispiriting end to a career.
So I'm a bit afraid that this panel is depressing. And I hope that these final statements were not as depressing as the panel before, but I'm not sure about this. So trying to lift up the mood, but I'm not sure if I will succeed here, is that I think we all can make a change. We all can make a difference. And the thing is, we need to focus on small steps, and this is something that we learn in Agile, at least I hope so, that it's all about incremental small steps, and then we look at where we are now and see what we can learn from there, and what is the next small step, and then what we shouldn't forget is to celebrate our successes.
Okay, so thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughts. I hope those were inspiring for the audience.